Hello, students of history and political science. I'm Mr. Tesh, and welcome to Global Chat, where we explore the ins and outs of the field of study known as comparative politics. This video is an introductory presentation for my AP Comparative Government and Politics students on the basic concepts that we're going to be using throughout our course. First, let's take a close look at some of the research methods that political scientists use to try and understand different countries in comparison. Then, let's go on and define some important concepts such as sovereignty, states, legitimacy, autonomy, and capacity. Throughout this unit, I want to encourage you to think about the following question. How can comparing countries and their political systems help us better understand the world around us? As you learn about how political scientists compare different systems of government with one another, try and think about how learning about this helps you better understand your own community, where you live, and your role in your own local government and as a citizen. Before we begin, let's actually try and see how much we already know about the world intuitively. Take a look at these 6 countries: the United Kingdom, Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria are all major countries in the world, and we're going to be learning about them in a lot of detail this year. Now let's say somebody asked you to rank these countries in order from least free to most free. In other words, in which of these countries is your liberty highly protected? And in which of these countries is liberty not protected? Take a moment and think about it, then give it a guess. How would you rank these countries from least to most free? Alright, here's the answer key. According to the Freedom House Index ranking, the only country that we study that is classified as entirely free is the United Kingdom, while Mexico and Nigeria are considered partly free. Meanwhile, Russia, Iran, and China are classified as not free. Oh, and if you were curious, here's where the United States would fit in. Now, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, wait, why does the United States rank behind the United Kingdom? I mean, we learn in school about how the important freedoms that we have guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights make the United States exceptional. And we know that there's certainly a lot of truth to that. The United States has always been known as one of the freest countries in the world. So what gives? It turns out that even the United States has some underlying political issues that have caused it to slide back a bit down this scale. The Freedom House tells us that partisan manipulation of the electoral process is one of the major issues that the United States faces. They're probably referring to gerrymandering and policies like voter identification laws that make it harder for many Americans to vote. Freedom House also mentions bias and dysfunction in the criminal justice system, which sadly we learned way too much about this year as civil rights protests swept across the country. In addition, Freedom House points to growing income inequality and the associated decline in economic opportunity and upward mobility as something that factored into their ranking of the United States. Now again, if you're like me, you might think, well, what if the Freedom House is biased? Are there other indexes that might rank the United States differently? I was curious, and so I looked it up, and I was really surprised to find that even the very conservative-leaning Cato Institute ranked the United States behind the United Kingdom in their 2019 Human Freedom Index. Be that as it may, let's try another exercise, only this time with a slightly different topic. This time, let's try and put these countries in order from where the average citizen is least wealthy to most wealthy. Take a moment to think about it, and then take a guess. How would you rank these countries in order of least wealthy to most wealthy average citizens? Alright, here's the answer key. Here again, the countries are ranked in terms of GDP per capita, something we're going to be studying later on in this presentation. In basic terms, it measures how productive the average person in a country is in a given year. Oh, and if you were wondering where the United States would fit into this picture, it turns out that the United States has a larger, more productive economy than the 6 countries that we study. In this case, the United States tops the list. But I should mention that there are a few countries in the world that do have a larger GDP per capita, even if they don't have a larger GDP overall, which is something we're going to be talking about later. Well, what do you think? Do these numbers tell us much about these different countries? What else would you want to know about them? And do these numbers tell us much about why different countries are ranked the way that they are? To get started, we need to learn about the methods that political scientists use. We will also need to talk about some basic concepts that we need to be aware of before starting comparing countries, like quantitative and qualitative data, the difference between causation and correlation, and how to distinguish between empirical and normative statements. Comparative politics is one of the major subfields of political science. Other major subfields of political science include international relations, political theory, and political economy. There's a lot of overlap between these different fields of study, and there are other smaller fields of study as well. Comparative politics allows us to ask some really big questions about the world. When and why do some authoritarian countries start to become democratic? Under what conditions do civil wars or revolutions erupt? Why do we have political parties in modern democracies? How can citizens hold governments accountable? Why are some countries wealthy and others poor? And what role does politics play in a country's economic development? By asking and attempting to answer questions like this, comparative politics helps us understand different countries around the world as we learn to compare them to one another. There are broadly two types of data that we use when we study comparative politics: quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data comes to us in the form of numbers, statistics, percentages. In our class, we're often going to be analyzing charts, tables, and graphs, especially of economic statistics. Qualitative data, on the other hand, comes in many forms. To keep things simple, we can define qualitative data as any data that's not numerical. For political scientists, qualitative data provides the information that quantitative data leaves out. It can include things like speeches, foundational documents, maps, political commentaries, political culture. Both of these are kinds of data that are very important to us, and they're going to help us make comparisons among and inferences about course countries. As we analyze data throughout the school year, we will be able to draw two broad types of conclusions. Whenever there appears to be a relationship between two or more events, we could say that the two are correlated with one another. Sometimes, when we are able to show that one event definitely leads to another, we can say that there is a causative relationship between two variables or events. I think this is easier to understand if I show you some examples. In 1979, the Iranian people overthrew their government in a revolution. This is something where historians and political scientists can study causation. We can determine with some degree of certainty what caused large numbers of Iranians to be discontent or unhappy with their government, and why they preferred to set up a new government under Islamic law. But it is not always easy to determine causation, and sometimes we can only say for certain that two variables are correlated. A good example of this is something political scientists call the resource curse, or the resource trap. The resource curse is a pretty interesting observation in political science. Most countries that have abundant natural resources, especially mineral resources like oil, tend to be underdeveloped and poorer than countries that do not. In this case, the large amount of natural resources are correlated with poorer economic performance. There are several explanations for this phenomenon that we're going to be studying later on in our course. For now, it's just important to remember the difference between causation and correlation. One last thing that we should talk about is the difference between empirical and normative statements. In a nutshell, empirical statements are those that are based on facts, while normative statements are based on value judgments or opinions. Here's a great example. Gallup did a poll, and 79% of British citizens believe their communities are a good place for immigrants to come and live, compared with only 33% of Polish citizens. This is an empirical statement because it is based on polling data or evidence. Now, don't be confused. Just because the poll is asking people for their opinion, it's still a factual statement, because it's a statement that's saying, here's how the people responded to this polling question. A normative statement is something very different. If I were to say something like, immigrants are better off moving to the United Kingdom than Poland, that's an example of a normative statement, because it's really just a personal opinion or a value judgment. All right, so now that we know what to do with the data when we come across it, let's look at some sources of data that we can use to study comparative politics. Before we dive into this, let me just say that there's a lot of overlap between economics and politics, and that a lot of the quantitative data that we're going to use in our course is often about economics. Some students are surprised by that, but we're going to be looking at this relationship between economics and politics quite a bit. For now, just be aware that we often look at economic statistics to try and understand the impact of different political systems on economic development, wealth, and productivity. In this section, I just want to talk about GDP, something called the Gini Index, the Freedom House Index, the Corruption Perceptions Index, and the Fragile States Index. A very important economic indicator is something called GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. GDP measures the total amount of wealth produced in a country each year. Looking at a state's GDP allows political scientists and economists to make generalizations about the wealth and productivity of that country. On this table, I have the most recently available GDP data for each of the countries that we study. If we look at it carefully, it looks like China is the wealthiest country overall. It produced $13,608 billion worth of goods and services last year. That means China's economy is 34 times larger than that of Nigeria, which produced only $397 billion worth of goods in that same year. But GDP can also be misleading because it doesn't take into account the size of each country's population. In this table, I've got each country's GDP per capita last year. GDP per capita is the average amount of wealth produced by the citizens in a country in a given year. It's actually really easy to calculate. You just take a country's GDP and divide it by that country's population. When you do that, we notice something important about productivity across the countries that we study. China, which tops the list in terms of GDP, falls behind the United Kingdom, Russia, and Mexico in terms of GDP per capita. This tells us that the Chinese economy is very large, but not as productive on average per person as some of the other countries that we study. But economists and political scientists also look at how much GDP is growing in each country. Because politics plays an important role in creating the environment for economic growth, this is another important measure that we can look at. On this chart, we see how much the economies of our 6 countries have grown each year since 2004. Almost every year, China tops the list, growing between 6 and 14% during this period. Whenever a country's economy is growing, we generally see that as a good thing. A growing economy means more businesses, more opportunities for people to find employment, more access to goods and services, less poverty, and in general, just more wealth being produced. Iran is one of the countries that stands out as having been kind of all over the place in terms of its economic growth. That light blue line is very inconsistent and seems kind of unpredictable. It turns out the people of Iran have become more and more dissatisfied with their government in recent years, with several recent protests around economic conditions making headlines. Where China's pretty steady economic rise has meant that its political regime has enjoyed a lot of stability, Iran has been experiencing the opposite. These are just some of the things that we're going to be studying in comparative politics. We look at what role the government may have played in nurturing economic growth and how the attitudes of people in society towards their government change when economic conditions are good or bad. For that, the GDP growth rate is a really valuable statistic. The Gini Coefficient measures how equally or unequally the wealth of a population is distributed. It is a statistic that is given as a value between 0 and 100, where 0 indicates a population that is perfectly equal in terms of wealth, and 100 indicates a population that is perfectly unequal. To wrap our heads around this concept, we can use an imperfect but useful metaphor. Picture a room full of children and their teacher. In this room, the teacher is the only person who has any income at all, meaning that the inequality of this population would be given by a Gini coefficient of 100. If the teacher were to leave the room, however, the children would be perfectly equal and would be represented by a Gini coefficient of 0. Of the countries that we study, the United Kingdom has the lowest degree of economic inequality, while Mexico has the highest. And while some degree of inequality is present in every country and is unavoidable, too much inequality can cause some real problems in society. The greater the degree of inequality, the more wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a few. This can lead to issues like corruption and a decline in social mobility. Earlier, we talked about the Freedom House Index. What this index tries to measure is the extent to which people in different countries enjoy human rights, such as the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of expression, the right to vote, and more. It ranks countries across these different categories and assigns each country in the world an average score. Just like we saw earlier, sometimes you have to peel back the surface a little bit to figure out why one country ranks higher or lower than another. In this map, only the countries that we study are shown in color. The United Kingdom ranks as the freest of the countries that we study, followed by Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, Iran, and China in that order. China ranks toward the bottom of this list because it has an authoritarian regime that uses coercion and censorship to maintain its grasp on political power, while Iran has a government based on religion, which is something we call a theocracy, and has a political culture and system of government that do not emphasize individual liberty and human rights in the same way as other countries. Later on in our course, these are the kinds of things that we're going to be studying in more detail. Okay, let me show you just one last very useful index that we can use in our course. This is called the Corruption Perceptions Index, and it ranks the countries in terms of how corrupt the government there is perceived to be. Here are the countries that we study again. Among them, the government of the United Kingdom is perceived to be the least corrupt, while that of Mexico, Russia, and Nigeria are perceived to be highly corrupt. When we study Russia later on in our course, we're going to discover that this is in large part because the Russian government has changed the constitution and rules of government several times since the year 2000 in order to benefit Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, and his political allies. Obviously, when a large section of society perceives a government to be corrupt, that's problematic because it can undermine the government's legitimacy. So in the previous slides, you may have noticed that I used a lot of vocabulary that you may not be familiar with. I used words like state, regime, nation, government, legitimacy, capacity, but we would never really define those words. This is a really good time to pause and take a look at these key concepts before we continue, because they will help us make more sense of things. Let's start by defining the word state. This is a classic definition of the term by the German philosopher Max Weber, who defined the state in his 1922 book, Economy and Society. Weber defined the state as an organization that maintains a monopoly of violence over a territory. To put it another way, states are political organizations that combine a permanent population with governing institutions to exercise control over a defined territory with international recognition. This is a political map of the world, and it shows us all of the 195 states in the world today. You probably talk about states all the time, but you may never even have realized it. If you talk about the United Kingdom, Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, Nigeria, Canada, you're talking about states. What sometimes confuses students is our definition, but if we think about it for a minute, it makes a lot of sense. Let's use Russia as an example. It's a state that controls a huge territory that stretches from Eastern Europe to Eastern Asia. Within that territory, only the state has the legitimate authority to use force. Russia uses force by creating institutions like a military and a police force. That's what we mean when we talk about states as political organizations that create institutions to exercise control over a defined territory. Another important concept is that of sovereignty, which is a state's authority to make its own decisions. To put it really simply, sovereignty is a state's independence from the influence of other states. A government's authority comes from its right to use power to enforce policies and decisions within a defined territory. Okay, now that we know some of these basic definitions, let's take a look at this diagram. We already know the definition of a state. The state is the foundation of this pyramid because it is the most permanent or institutionalized. Governments make decisions on behalf of a state, but governments are subject to rules and norms of behavior. These rules are what we refer to as regimes, which are defined as the fundamental rules that control access to and the exercise of political power. There are two broad types of regimes, democratic and authoritarian. We will be talking about a lot of different subtypes of regimes throughout our course, but for now, these are the two broad categories that we need to be aware of. Regimes are less institutionalized than states and do sometimes change. Changes in regimes occur when rules and institutions are changed. This can happen very slowly over time, or it can happen very suddenly through something like a coup or a revolution. Which leaves us with defining a government. Governments are the institutions or individuals who make decisions on behalf of a state. So unlike regimes, which rarely change, and states, which only change very rarely, governments change all the time. Political office holders often change through elections, or in some countries, through lines of succession. Governments can also be changed by more violent means, such as revolutions or coups. We have seen several military coups in Nigeria's history, for example. The last term that we need to define is nation, which refers to people who live within a state. A nation is a group of people who have commonalities like race, language, religion, ethnicity, political identity, and aspirations. States sometimes have one, but most are made up of several distinct nations. We're going to be looking at the concept of nations and nationality a lot more in our next unit. The United Kingdom is a good example of a country that's made up of several distinct nations. The regions of Scotland, England, and Wales make up the island called Great Britain, and together with Northern Ireland are a part of the United Kingdom. Each of these regions is made up of a different nation, and even though all of the people from here are British citizens, they have their own national identities. If you've ever met someone from Scotland, you'll know that if you ask them where they're from, they're almost always going to say, "I'm from Scotland," and not, "I'm from Great Britain." This is because the Scottish people are proud of their culture and heritage, and also more likely to refer to themselves as Scottish because of that. The British government allows Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to have a great deal of local autonomy or decision-making authority. They even have national parliaments of their own. Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales have a lot of control over things like their education system, their healthcare systems, and more. If you're wondering why the United Kingdom would want to allow the people of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to have more autonomy of their own, the answer has to do with something called legitimacy. Legitimacy refers to whether a government's constituents believe their government has the right to use power in the way that they do. In other words, a government is legitimate when the people who are governed believe in or respect their government's right to rule. Legitimacy gives authority to a government and can increase a government's power. Earlier, I had talked about Max Weber and his famous definition of a state. Weber described three distinct sources of legitimacy that are useful to us: traditional legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and rational legal legitimacy. Let's take a quick look at each of these. Traditional legitimacy is the kind of legitimacy that exists when an institution becomes part of a country's history, culture, and tradition. The United Kingdom is an interesting case of this because it combines democracy with monarchy. Today, Queen Elizabeth II formally represents the United Kingdom as its head of state, and someday, members of her family, the Windsor family, will succeed her as head of state. Now, you might assume that the citizens of a democracy like the United Kingdom would be very unhappy to still be the subjects of a queen. But that's completely untrue. In 2018, a poll by Statista found that over 2/3 of the British people support the monarchy. This shows that the monarchy enjoys a high degree of legitimacy in the United Kingdom, in part because it is a long-standing institution and has become part of the country's history and its culture. This is what we mean when we talk about traditional legitimacy. Earlier, I had asked why the people of Iran would choose to give one man, Khomeini, almost dictatorial power over themselves and their country. The answer is something political scientists call charismatic legitimacy. Khomeini was an Islamic scholar in the deeply religious country of Iran. He became popular after he was exiled for calling for a return to a theocratic government, a government in which religion is central. Khomeini believed that the people of Iran would be happier and better off if they made their political decisions on the basis of Islam, the majority religion in Iran. The people loved Khomeini and called for him to be returned from his exile so that he could establish a government on these principles. An extremely charismatic man, Khomeini was loved and respected by the people that he would eventually come to govern. This kind of charisma by an individual leader is exactly what we mean when we talk about charismatic legitimacy. Finally, we should also talk about the idea of rational legal legitimacy. This is the kind of legitimacy often held in democratic regimes, and is maintained by holding free and fair elections, applying laws fairly and equally to all citizens, and enforcing law and order in the public interest. This leads constituents or people to trust that their government is acting in the best interest of a majority of the population. Finally, let's move on to our last topic of the day. We need to talk about the kinds of power that states have and the different ways that power can be divided between national and local governments. Earlier, when I was talking about the United Kingdom, I mentioned that the national government in London allows local governments in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland to have a great deal of local autonomy. The process of decentralizing power or delegating power to subnational governments is something that we call devolution. The United Kingdom has what we would call a unitary system of government. A unitary state is one in which power is concentrated at the national level of government. In our course, the United Kingdom, China, and Iran are examples of unitary states. To be sure, all of these countries have regional or local governments, but these local governments only have those powers that are delegated to them by the central government. In the United Kingdom, power is devolved by Parliament to the Scottish National Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, and the Northern Ireland Assembly. Both the Welsh and Scottish parliaments were established in 1999, fulfilling a promise made by Tony Blair to devolve power. Federal systems of government function very differently than these unitary systems. Rather than concentrating all power in the central government, power is shared between central and regional or local governments. In our course, Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria have what we can call federal systems of government. Nigeria is a very good example of a state with a federal system. Of the countries that we study, Nigeria is by far the most diverse country, with over 250 ethnic groups speaking around 500 different languages. Here, federalism has been a really good way to divide power because it allows local groups to make some decisions for themselves. Northern Nigeria, for example, is predominantly Muslim, while the south is predominantly Christian. 12 northern states still practice Islamic law to at least some extent, with many having even set up Sharia courts, or courts of Islamic law. This kind of arrangement can reduce conflict, especially in very diverse states. Imagine if Nigeria had a unitary system of government, and think about how the Muslims in the north would feel if a government that was predominantly Christian banned the practice of observing Islamic law, or vice versa. In this sense, federalism has the ability to at least reduce the chance of political conflict between different groups of people by protecting the ability of local governments to make decisions based on local beliefs and local customs. This is a good place to bring up two different kinds of power that states have, autonomy and capacity. Autonomy refers to a state's ability to wield power independently of the public, while capacity is the ability of a state to provide basic political goods that society needs, such as security, education, health services, economic opportunity, and a legal framework to maintain order. To understand this a little better, let's break down this chart. States that have a low degree of autonomy and a low degree of capacity are unable to fulfill basic tasks, both because they lack the ability to provide the kinds of political goods I mentioned earlier, and because of the inability to reach consensus and make decisions. In the past, and to some extent even today, Nigeria may have fallen in this category. Because it is a democracy, Nigeria's Congress was sometimes factionalized and unable to find agreement among its many different members to effectively govern, while at the same time lacking the ability to raise the necessary tax revenue to provide basic public goods, like infrastructure. On the other extreme end of the spectrum, we have states with a very high degree of autonomy and capacity. These are often called strong states. I think China is a really good example of this. China has an authoritarian regime, and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party can expect to govern however it decides, without much pushback from the public, or even from within the government. This is what we mean when we talk about a high degree of autonomy. Actually, having a very high degree of autonomy is a key characteristic of authoritarian states, although democratic systems of government can also result in a high degree of autonomy. On the other hand, China is also very capable of providing political goods such as security, education, and more. I think China really checks all the boxes and is a good example of a strong state. To get a better understanding of this chart, let's try a few examples together. Take a moment and think about this example. State X is highly developed and wealthy and raises lots of taxes through income and sales taxes. The state could institute a national health program, but the public keeps voting against it. Which of the following statements is true? A. State X has high capacity, or B. State X has high autonomy? If you answered A, State X has high capacity, then you got it right. Because the state has a great deal of wealth and can raise taxes, it has the capacity to provide a national health program. The fact that the state can't institute a national health program because the voters keep voting against it would indicate that the state has a low degree of autonomy. It can't really make the decision independently of the public. Let's try another one. Take a moment and think about this example. State X has relatively little tax revenue, and public non-compliance is common. Few people bother to pay their taxes at all, and the state struggles to prevent criminal activity. Which of the following statements is true? A. State X has low capacity. B. State X has high capacity. If you answered A, state X has low capacity, you got it right. Because the state doesn't collect enough tax revenue and struggles to prevent criminal activity, this one meets our definition for a state with low capacity. One last example. Take a moment and think this one through. State X is a poor country with a monarchical system of government. The king alone has the power to make decisions for the state, but a lack of tax revenue means his state really can't afford much. Which of the following is true? A, state X has high capacity, or B, state X has high autonomy? If you answered B, you got it right. If the king of state X has the authority to make decisions with the force of law, that means the public does not have a lot of influence over the government. That's exactly what we mean when we talk about a state having a high degree of autonomy. So that's it then. In this presentation, we've talked about research methods in comparative politics, various quantitative data sources, the concepts of states, regimes, and governments, and the ways in which states divide power. For more information and additional resources, please check in the description below this video. And remember to subscribe to catch more of our videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time!